Thank you for joining us, Mary, and congratulations on being selected for the Donner Prize shortlist.
Thank you so much for having me, and I'm thrilled to be on the list.
Now, I understand there was a certain political event that was the impetus for this book.
In June of 2008, Stéphane Dion, who was then Liberal leader, came into the Globe and Mail editorial board to discuss his carbon tax. I was a member of the editorial board, and I was the one who wrote about policy issues. I'd read the tax, and it seemed to indicate that the Liberals wanted to do a huge transfer of income between the West and the rest of the country, but the numbers weren't clear. So I kept pushing Stéphane Dion in order to try and figure out if this was the case and how the numbers were working. He finally almost shouted, "It will be good for them." He meant the West. It took me a while to figure this out. He meant they were going to have to put money into universities to figure out ways to reduce carbon taxes. It was a very inelegant way of putting it. Stephen Harper campaigned against the tax in the fall of 2008. He won big. I wanted to figure out what was behind these feelings of animosity that could be roused so strongly. I knew about the National Energy Program, and I knew about the earlier fights between Pierre Trudeau and Peter Lougheed. But as I started looking into the subject, I realized that this issue went back and back and back in time to the 1870s, actually the 1860s. And people have multiple identities. I became convinced that this formation of this regional identity was strong and it was lasting, and you can see it to this day. A notion of suspicion, a wish not to have the federal government interfere in provincial affairs such as resource management and carbon taxes.
Why do you think having a historical perspective is so important in today's political climate?
If you don't know the past, you cannot understand all of the frictions that can be aroused around resource control in 2013. I discovered, for example, that the three Western provinces, we all knew that they didn't get resource control when they were created as provinces, unlike any other province in Confederation. What I didn't know is why it took until 1930 to remedy that problem. It took until 1930 because it wasn't just a fight between Ottawa and the Western provinces. All the other provinces said, we bought the West. We put up the money to get the land from the Hudson's Bay Company. Therefore, we own you. If you want to give resource control to these three provinces, you have to make it up to us. So you can see frictions to this day. People don't even realize why they've got these ideas in their heads, why they understand it. You cannot have Ottawa impose a carbon tax today. You just cannot. The provinces have to do it themselves.
Now, in your book, there's a line that says, all resources should be shared, except mine. Is this a strictly Canadian mentality? I
didn't realize how this came to be. The feds buy the land in 1870. Nobody bothers to tell the Red River Colony. Louis Riel resists. He wants a province. He's a very educated, smart man. He stood up in the Provisional Government Assembly and read the Canadian Constitution into the record and singled out resource control as one of the things that was really important for his government. So what you have is, he wanted a province. Sir John A. Macdonald knew he had to give him a province, but he kept resource control. And in later years, some people have blamed Riel for insisting upon the creation of a province too early, so it didn't get that control. I think we were watching a very smart cookie in action. It's true, later he was mentally ill, but in 1869, 1870, when you read those records, this is someone very, very smart. And he knew what he wanted. He wanted to be able to control the land distribution, and he wanted to be able to sell timber leases, and he wanted, desperately, to know the mineral wealth. He asked for a survey.
You mentioned a number of events throughout Canadian history. What is it about November 1918 that is so important in the development of Canada?
There were several occasions when Ottawa might have, when a better prime minister might have been able to hand back the resources. Poor Robert Borden, he just managed to survive the war. The last thing he could get involved in was resource control. But the three Western premiers were on his case. Their resources had managed the war effort. They had fed everyone. Their coal had fueled the war machine. So he had to put that on the agenda, along with matters such as soldier settlement and immigration. He called a conference, and then he got in a boat and went to Europe for the peace conference. Everybody turned up, and the premiers insisted on resource control. And when they couldn't get it, when all of the rest of Canada said no, they all wrote fierce letters to each other. It's a very unknown conference. Nobody pays attention to it, but I read the record, and there are the letters. Right in that microcosm, you have the story of regional tensions in Confederation from 1870 to today.
Natural resources are something that make Canada a very strong country internationally, but yet it seems to be what's causing the struggles and divisiveness here at home.
There's no reason the economy and the environment have to be different ends. There is a way to fix it. But that regional identity has led many businesses, many oil companies, many resource firms in Alberta and Saskatchewan in particular, to wish to have hands off because they don't want increased carbon taxes. Who would? It's obviously up to the provincial governments to sell to their residents and to the rest of Canada they're going to do their best.
Throughout your vast research, was there anything that surprised you?
I was always learning. I would go to the archives and get records brought across the river from Privy Council events and photocopy them and then sit up at night and read them. And if you read the fine print, you would discover some of the most remarkable claims and tensions. One of the things that surprised me was Robert Borden, Sir Robert Borden. The more I read, the more I realized that he couldn't stand domestic politics, and he hated being nibbled at by individual people who wanted patronage or something. He did his duty, he was resolute. When he went abroad, he came alive. He spent a night in the trenches with David Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, and it's clear that he really, almost in a terrible kind of way, I mean, this was an interesting, sensitive man, he enjoyed himself. He was with David Lloyd George. He was at the heart of events. Every time he came back to Canada, if you read his memoirs, he's saying, oh, I'm sick, I'm going to have to push on. He just would, sometimes he would just cross the border. He would see a great art collection in New York, get across the border, and he was ill. As soon as he got there, his back hurt. I became rather mesmerized by him. I became interested in the book in the premiers, these Western premiers. They were incredibly interesting people. Nobody knew or remembered Sir Frederick Haultain. There's a portrait of him in the legislature building in Alberta. It's on its own wall, I guess because he wasn't really an Alberta premier. He was premier of the territories. And he's holding a cigarette, and they call it the smoker's corner on the tours. Everyone's forgotten about him. Yet at the time, even when he came to central Canada, the Globe was chronicling his social events. He was considered a personage. And what drove him crazy was he couldn't get Sir Clifford Sifton's attention. Couldn't, no matter what. Because in the West, everything he said, it was God speaking.
Well, and finally, Mary, not that you cover this extensively in your book, but as the quote goes, those who don't remember the past are condemned to repeat it. How do you see change taking place?
The Western provinces are going to have to work with the other provinces, with the other premiers, and eventually put on a carbon tax. In the meantime, Alberta has a carbon tax. It's only on if there are exorbitant releases of carbon. I think that what's going to have to happen is Alberta is going to have to raise its carbon taxes. I think it will do it in conjunction eventually with Saskatchewan. BC has a carbon tax. I think the provinces, through the Council of the Federation, as when the premiers get together, are going to have to agree on a joint effort. And they might even request Ottawa to use a vehicle such as the fuel excise tax. The best suggestions I've seen are still the ones from Jack Mintz and Nancy Olaweiler, talking about how you can use a mechanism like that to make it revenue neutral and to raise revenues. But that's the future. Ottawa cannot barge in. Those days are gone.
That's great, Mary. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.